It was just past 6 in the morning on October 25th, 1944. The ships of Taffy 3 were stirring with the routines of another day at sea. Aboard the destroyer, escort Samuel B. Roberts crewmen lined up for breakfast in the mess. The captain was heading to the officer's wardroom for coffee when his radar technician reported something odd on the scope. The display showed a dense cluster of echoes bearing 330, about 30 miles away. The captain peered through a porthole, saw a mass of gray clouds on the horizon, and told the man to keep an eye on it. Within minutes, a lookout shouted that he had spotted masts on the horizon. The shapes rising there did not belong to any American fleet. Across the scattered formation of jeep carriers and screening destroyers, the same awful recognition spread. Lookouts on the destroyer Johnston saw towering shell splashes straddling the escort carrier Gambier Bay. Ellsworth Welch, a young officer on the Johnston, instinctively looked skyward for enemy bombers. Then he understood. The columns of water were not falling from aircraft. They were coming from the horizon itself. Somewhere beyond the squalls, the Japanese center force had opened fire. The battleship Yamato, the largest warship in the world, had trained its 18-inch guns on them. On the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague watched the brilliantly colored splashes, pink, red, purple, green, rising around his carriers and knew at once that this was no drill. The enemy they had been told was fleeing was advancing, and it was coming straight at them. Ernest Evans, the Cherokee warrior commanding the destroyer Johnston, took in the situation at a glance. His ship was closest to the advancing Japanese fleet, consigned to quick destruction. But Evans saw no need to await orders. He grabbed the ship's intercom and barked out a rapid-fire sequence. All hands to general quarters. Prepare to attack the Japanese fleet. Flank speed ahead. Then came the order that stunned his crew. Left full rudder. The Johnston wheeled out of formation, charging alone toward the enemy battleships and cruisers on the horizon. Bob Hagan, the Johnston's gunnery officer, ran his numbers and calculated a 50-50 chance of survival. He climbed to the gun director, watching the range close from 35,000 yards to 18,000. At 7:10, the distance finally reached maximum gun range. Hagan closed his firing key, and the Johnston's 5-inch guns came barking to life. The target was the heavy cruiser Kumano, flagship of Cruiser Division 7. Hagan's radar-directed gunnery proved superior to the Japanese optical systems. Shell after shell struck the Kumano's superstructure, tearing up metalwork and killing men in exposed positions. On the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague watched the Johnston's lone charge and knew he had to act. At 7:16, he got on the TBS circuit and ordered his screen commander, Commander William Thomas, aboard the Hool to form 2 torpedo groups, the big destroyers and the little destroyer escorts. Under Thomas's command, the Hool, led by Captain Kintberger, and the destroyer Heermann, under Commander Amos T. Hathaway, turned to follow the Johnston's lead. Meanwhile, on the flight decks of Sprague's 6 jeep carriers, plane handlers raced to launch every available aircraft. Pilots climbed into their Wildcats and Avengers, many carrying whatever ordnance happened to be on hand. Depth charges, anti-personnel bombs, even propaganda leaflets. At 7:24, with the range down to 10,000 yards, Evans shouted the order to fire torpedoes. 10 Mark 15 torpedoes leaped from their tubes, hit the water, and ran hot, straight, and normal toward the Japanese column. Evans ordered a hard turn to port, and the Johnston entered her own smoke screen. Moments later, Welch and others on deck saw a tall column of water rise beside the Kumano. One torpedo had struck the cruiser in the bow, ripping it clean away. The crippled flagship fell out of line, limping along at 14 knots, effectively out of the battle. Ensign Bill Brooks had been the first to spot the Japanese fleet from his Avenger. Now he orbited above the enemy ships, reporting their movements as flak burst around him. The pilots who got airborne faced a nightmare. No time to form up, no proper weapons for attacking battleships. But they dove on the Japanese cruisers anyway, strafing with machine guns, dropping their light bombs, and making dummy runs with empty bomb bays to force the enemy to maneuver. Every turn the Japanese took to avoid an imaginary torpedo was time they were not closing on Sprague's fleeing carriers. In the midst of this aerial distraction, The Johnston was racing back through her own smoke to return to the carriers. She had fired her torpedoes and survived untouched, a miracle that could not last. The Japanese battleship Congo, her rangefinders tracking the American destroyer, trained her 14-inch guns. A full broadside flashed from the sleek turrets. 3 enormous shells found their mark. The first shell struck the main deck, blew through the machine shop, and exploded against the reduction gears in the after engine room. The second punched through the deck and detonated against the main steam turbine. The third demolished the after boiler, extinguishing its oil-burning flames. The Johnston's speed was cut from 36 knots to 17. High-pressure superheated steam from shattered pipes filled the engineering spaces, killing every man in the after fear room instantly. The hits did not stop. A 6-inch shell from the Yamato's secondary battery holed the number 2 exhaust stack and detonated under the director platform. 2 more slammed into the port bridge wing. The blast all but undressed Evans. It blew off his hat, tore the shirt from his chest, and lodged shrapnel in his face, neck, hand, and torso. 2 fingers were sliced from his left hand. When the ship's doctor came to his aid, Evans waved him off. "Don't bother me now," he said. "Help some of those guys who are hurt." The captain remained in command, directing the ship's course from the fantail, calling orders down through an open hatch to the men manually turning the rudder. Hagen had often seen Evans's heart grinning as he led the ship into danger, and now, even in ruin, that spirit remained. The hull pressed in, closing the range to the battleship Congo. At 9,000 yards, Captain Kintberger ordered a half salvo of 5 torpedoes. They leaped from the tubes and ran hot and true toward the Japanese dreadnought. Commander Thomas, the screen commander, was on the bridge alongside Kintberger, coordinating the attack. But the hull paid for the approach. A shell struck the bridge high on the port side, killing most of the wheelhouse crew. Another punched through the forward Führer room, blasting a hole in the hull. The ship lost steering and 1 engine. Kintberger, his command bleeding speed and control, gave the order for a second torpedo attack as the hull carved an uncontrollable circle through the smoke. The second salvo of 5 torpedoes went over the side as the hull swung helplessly. The crew could only hope their fish would find a mark. Then the Japanese cruisers closed in. A salvo tore into the after engine room, freezing the port screw. Another demolished the after fur room, unleashing a holocaust of superheated steam. 16 of 17 men died in that compartment. The hull began to list heavily, dead in the water. Kintberger knew the fight was finished. He passed the word to abandon ship. Men leaped over the rails into the oil-slicked sea, their home sinking beneath them. To the south, the Samuel B. Roberts closed with the heavy cruiser Chikuma. Lieutenant Commander Copeland held his fire until the range dropped to 5,000 yards. Then he let his gunnery officer loose. The 5-inch guns began a rapid, accurate barrage. Paul Carr's crew in Gun 52 worked feverishly, loading and firing as fast as the shells came up the hoist. The shells raked the cruiser's superstructure. Fires erupted on the Chikuma's bridge and along her decks. Lieutenant John Leclerc, commanding the aft 40mm mount, trained his guns on the enemy and opened fire. The Chikuma answered. Her 8-inch guns flashed and a salvo struck the Roberts. 1 shell pierced the forward handling room, another hit the main deck below the whaleboat. The worst struck the forward room, tearing apart steam lines and killing all but 2 men. The Roberts shuddered, her speed dropping as the forward boiler died. Still, the guns kept firing. The sea around them was stained with the die loads of Japanese shells, red, green, yellow, but the Roberts' gunners did not flinch. A direct hit from an 8-inch shell obliterated Leclerc's 40mm mount, erasing him and his 12 crewmen from the deck. Above the ships, the air war intensified. Planes from Taffy 2 and Taffy 3 arrived in waves, pressing home attacks on the Japanese cruisers. Wildcat fighters dove through flak, strafing decks and superstructures. Avengers weaved in with bomb bay doors open, forcing the enemy ships to maneuver. The Gambier Bay, already battered and falling behind the formation, took another hit. A shell struck her forward engine room and she began to list to port. Her speed dropped to 11 knots. she was a wounded animal and the Japanese cruisers closed in for the kill. Despite the mounting damage, the destroyer's screen held the line. The Heermann, her torpedoes spent, engaged the battleship Haruna with gunfire alone, scoring hits that started fires. The Johnston, broken but defiant, continued to fire her remaining guns. The Japanese heavy cruisers, slowed by the constant air attacks and the desperate resistance of the tin cans, could not overtake the fleeing escort carriers. Time was running out for Taffy 3, but the screen had bought precious minutes. The carriers still had a chance. The Gambier Bay, abandoned by most of her crew, was finished now. The Japanese heavy cruisers had been hammering her at point-blank range for nearly 2 hours. Captain Vuegg was among the last to leave, falling 40 feet through smoke and steam into the sea. He surfaced just in time to swim clear of the 10,000-ton bulk as it rolled to starboard and slipped beneath the waves. At 9:07, the first American carrier ever sunk by enemy surface gunfire was gone. Not far to the south, the Samuel B. Roberts was going the same way. Copeland finally gave the order to abandon ship. The little destroyer escort had fired every round she had left, her decks a slaughterhouse of men and machinery. On the fantail, gunner's mate Paul Carr was found cradling a last shell, his chest torn open, struggling to lift it into the wrecked breach. He died there, the deck of his broken ship, the only ground a man like him would ever need. The Roberts slid under at about 10 in the morning, her bow pointing to the sky like a final salute. Then came the Johnston's turn. The destroyer that had charged alone into the teeth of the Japanese fleet was now a floating wreck, dead in the water, her guns silent. Captain Evans, shirtless and covered in blood, walked toward the fantail as the abandoned ship order passed. Men saw him making his way aft. Some said they passed him without a word, his eyes blank, his duty done. No one saw him get into the whaleboat. The Johnston rolled and went down by the bow around 10:10, taking her Cherokee Warrior with her. In the water, the survivors of the Johnston and Roberts watched their ships disappear. Oil slicks spread across the swells, turning the sea black. Men coughed and spat fuel, clinging to wreckage and life rafts. Some had watched their homes burn, and now treaded water in 4,000-fathom deep water, alone with their thoughts and the slow roll of the Philippine Sea. And then, a Japanese destroyer approached the Johnston survivors, slow and deliberate. The men braced for machine gun fire. But the destroyer slid past at close range, her crew standing at the rail, some saluting, others filming. A sailor tossed a can of tomatoes into the water. It was packed in Arkansas, 3 years of war, and they were still throwing American rations. Inside the Japanese fleet, Admiral Kurita was wrestling with a decision he could not postpone. His ships had taken terrible punishment from the American planes. The Chokai was crippled. The Chikuma was barely steering. He had heard Kinkai's frantic calls for help on the radio, and he feared the fast battleships of the Third Fleet were closing in at any moment. At 9:11, he issued the order, "Rendezvous, my course north, speed 20." The Japanese heavy cruisers, minutes from annihilating Sprague's carriers, turned and steamed away. On the Fanshawe Bay, Clifton Sprague saw the Japanese ships begin to recede. He had started the battle certain he would be swimming within the hour. Now he watched the pagoda masts of the enemy fleet grow smaller on the horizon. A signalman shouted, "God damn it, boys, they're getting away!" Sprague allowed himself to believe it. The impossible had happened. The outgunned little ships of Taffy 3 had held the line and lived to see the enemy retreat. The battle was not over for everyone. At 11 o'clock, the St. Lo, battered but still afloat, was hit by a Japanese fighter plane diving straight into her flight deck. The explosion set off a chain of secondary blasts that tore the ship apart. She went down in half an hour, a pillar of black smoke marking her grave. The survivors of Taffy 3's other ships watched from the water, numb and silent. Of the men who led the fight, many would not return home. Ernest Evans, the Cherokee warrior who had charged his crippled destroyer into the heart of the Japanese fleet, was lost with his ship, never seen again. John Leclerc, the young officer commanding the Samuel B. Roberts's after 40mm mount, was among the first to give his life that day when an explosion erased his station. Lieutenant Commander Copeland, who could not swim, floated in a life raft with his surviving crew, waiting for rescue. Leon Kintberger, who had abandoned the hull when she was dead in the water, survived in an overcrowded raft with Screen Commander William Thomas bleeding from a shattered arm. Amos Hathaway, who had fought his destroyer against 4 battleships, brought his ship south to safety. Bob Hagan, Ellsworth Welch, and the young pilot Bill Brooks, who had first spotted the enemy fleet, all miraculously endured hours in the water and were pulled from the sea. Commander Thomas, Taffy 3's screen commander, died of his wounds the following day. What held the line that morning was not radar or steam pressure or torpedoes. It was the human will of men who knew they would not make it and went in anyway. When the Japanese admiral asked his staff what they had faced, they told him they had been driven off by the Third Fleet. They could not believe that a handful of escort carriers and destroyers had beaten them, but that is exactly what happened. The men of Taffy 3 did not win by destroying the enemy. They won by refusing to run. If you have a personal story, a family memory, or a historical anecdote from the Pacific Campaign or the home front, share it in the comments below. We do read them. And if you want to support more documentaries like this one, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. We are deeply grateful for your support and for listening.